Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we are going to take a closer look at a vulnerability that has a lot of developers worried.
Yeah, definitely a hot topic in the security community right now.
We're talking about CVE 2025-27407,
Right.
which is a critical vulnerability found in the GraphQL-Ruby gem.
Affecting potentially millions of applications?
Millions, yeah, it's a big
Yeah,
one. Um, and this one is particularly nasty because it could allow attackers to remotely execute code.
that's right. Remote code execution, one of the worst case
Yeah, the
scenarios
big one, yeah.
when you're talking about vulnerabilities.
So for our listeners out there who may not be familiar with GraphQL-Ruby, maybe you can just give us a quick overview of what it is and why it's such a big deal that this vulnerability exists.
Sure. So GraphQL-Ruby is a gem, a library that's used for building GraphQL APIs.
Right.
GraphQL itself is a query language for APIs.
Okay.
It's been gaining a lot of popularity in recent years as an alternative to REST APIs. And GraphQL-Ruby is one of the most popular libraries for implementing GraphQL in Ruby applications.
I see. Okay.
The problem is this gem, it's been downloaded over 136 million times.
Wow.
So we're talking about a massive number of applications that could potentially be impacted by this vulnerability.
So we've got a really popular piece of software that's used in a ton of different applications.
Right.
And then we have this critical vulnerability with a CVSS score of 9.1.
Yeah, that's pretty much as high as it gets.
Pretty much as bad as it gets, which means that this vulnerability is not something to be taken lightly.
Not at all.
So let's get into the nitty-gritty here.
Okay.
How exactly does this vulnerability work? Can you walk us through the technical details?
Okay, so the vulnerability stems from the way the gem handles schema loading.
Okay.
Specifically, there are a couple of functions, GraphQL schema.fromIntrospection and GraphQL schema.loader.load, that are vulnerable. These functions are used to load a GraphQL schema from different sources, and the vulnerability lies in how they process the input. An attacker could craft a malicious GraphQL schema definition that, when loaded by a vulnerable application, can actually trigger remote code execution.
Okay. So it's almost like a Trojan horse.
Exactly. It's a very good analogy.
This innocent-looking schema definition,
Right.
it actually contains malicious code.
Yes.
And once it's loaded into the application,
boom,
the attacker can potentially take control.
Yeah, it's pretty scary stuff.
That's scary stuff.
And what makes it even more dangerous is that many applications actually fetch schemas from external sources,
Oh, I see.
which may not be trustworthy.
Right.
For example, some tools like GraphQL Client use a technique called GraphQL introspection to pull in schemas. And this process could inadvertently introduce the vulnerability if the schema being pulled in is malicious.
Okay, so break that down for me. GraphQL introspection.
Yeah, it's basically a way for a client to ask a GraphQL API,
Okay.
hey, what kind of data and operations do you support?
Okay, so it's basically like a discovery mechanism.
Exactly.
Right?
Very useful feature.
Right.
But in this case, it can be abused because an attacker could potentially craft a malicious schema
Right.
that would then be fetched through introspection and loaded into the application.
Oh, wow. Okay, so the implications of this are huge.
Absolutely. And it's not just theoretical.
Right.
There are real-world consequences.
Yeah.
If an attacker successfully exploits this vulnerability, they could do all sorts of things. They could steal sensitive information, disrupt the application, basically render it unusable,
Right.
or even worse, use the compromised server as a launching pad for further attack.
It's a domino effect.
It is, yeah.
So for anyone out there listening who's using GraphQL-Ruby, I mean, what are the steps that they need to take to protect themselves?
The most important thing is to update to a patched version of the gem.
Okay.
The maintainers of GraphQL-Ruby have already released a fix.
Great.
So you need to make sure that you update your application to use the latest version.
ASA-AT.
Yes, definitely a top priority.
This is a good reminder for everyone to keep their software up to date, not just GraphQL-Ruby, but any software that you're using, because these kinds of vulnerabilities are constantly being discovered.
It's an ongoing battle.
It is, yeah.
But it's an important one.
Right, and this particular vulnerability, it really raises a bigger question.
Yeah.
About the security of the software supply chain as a whole.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue.
It is, yeah.
And there's no easy answer, but it's something we definitely need to be thinking about.
How can we prevent these types of vulnerabilities from impacting millions of users in the future?
Right. It's a challenge.
It's a big challenge.
But one that we need to address.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it for today.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through this vulnerability.
My pleasure.
It's definitely been an eye-opening discussion.
It has.
And to all our listeners out there, stay vigilant, stay safe, and keep your software up to date.
Absolutely good advice.
Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.
See ya. Bye.